For our first online lesson, we're going to take a look at Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, evolution is an important theory in the field of psychology and neuroscience because it helps us to understand how the brain evolved from one-celled organisms all the way up to human beings. As you can see, evolution is described as a gradual change in the structure and physiology of plant and animal species, producing generally more complex organisms. Evolution is tied to the theory of functionalism, which is basically the idea that a trait or a structure is important because of how it functions or operates for the organism. This is also tied to William James's theory of pragmatism. What's the practical value of an eyeball, an arm, or in many cases, an idea or a theory? Evolution can actually occur in one of actually several ways, but we're going to focus on two ways for the sake of this course. The first way that we're going to look at evolution is through natural selection, and the process by which inherited traits that confer a selective advantage become more prevalent in a population. Basically, the organism that's best suited or adapted to its environment is more likely to survive and procreate. And that's really the whole point of evolution, is it's the survival of your genes. It isn't about you surviving forever, because if you live to be 150 years old but never make any babies, then you're a genetic dead end. The goal is actually to procreate. So on one hand, surviving and living longer gives you more opportunities, but you'd actually be better off if you didn't live quite so long if you had more reproductive opportunities. And that leads us to the next type of selection process that occurs, and that's sexual selection, the process by which some organisms outcompete other organisms for access to mates. And this primarily works out in the case of males trying to outcompete other males for access to females, or females simply choosing certain traits of some males and ignoring the traits of others. And again, the idea here is to try and make as many babies as possible. So you want to make sure that you have as many opportunities to procreate as possible. This leads us to one of my favorite stories behind evolution, and that is the idea of the peacock. Now, it's actually interesting because Charles Darwin was kind of mortified by the peacock because initially he felt that it didn't really support his idea of natural selection. He said, I'm sick to my stomach every time I see one of those things, which is kind of funny. But the idea there is that when you look at a male peacock with his giant peacock tail, what you realize is that that doesn't necessarily give him a whole lot of advantage for his personal survival. Those big tails are unwieldy, you can't take them off when you're not using them, and in fact it makes you a much larger target for predators like tigers. So, well, what's the deal there? Well, this is sexual selection. As it turns out, that big colorful peacock tail is a big sign to male female peahens that this is the male you want to mate with. It's got lots of eyes, lots of color, and the message is I've got a ton of extra energy, I've got awesome genes, and that's going to be passed along to your offspring. And so the male peacocks get many more opportunities to mate. Now, that male peacock might not live as many years as his buddy who's got a smaller tail. However, he's going to have more offspring. And here you can see that the percent of total matings was much higher for a peacock with a larger, more colorful tail than for the peacocks with the shorter, less colorful tails. So you get more mating opportunities, you get more opportunities to keep your genes in the gene pool, and, well, that's the whole point according to evolution. So this is one of those things where, again, natural selection might say, oh, you're better off with a smaller tail because you'll stay alive longer. But sexual selection says you're better off with a larger tail because you're going to have more mating opportunities. The next thing I'd like you to think about is like, okay, well, Professor Weber, I'm not a peacock. How does this apply to me? I want you to stop and think for a moment, and you can pause the audio or video for this if you need to. But think about what is it that male humans might do that sort of seems like peacocking in an effort to attract a female mate. Now, here's the case. Think about, your average sort of man at a bar, a singles bar. Well, they're going to probably try and show off their size. Look at how big my muscles are. They might try wearing a nice suit. Or sometimes they'll talk about their car. And so the idea here is look at my resources, because that's one of the big things that we see time and time again when we look at females who are doing the choosing. Females like males with more resources, whether they're physical resources or reproductive resources, or whether they're resources like access to food or water or money or territory. Not very romantic, but it turns out that that's just the case. The next thing you can think about is turning this around. Well, what is it that females might have or do to attract males? Also not very romantic. Female humans are going to be considered more attractive by the opposite sex if they are young, if they are curvaceous, and if they're beautiful, because beauty is a sign of health. So while we're a little more complex than peacocks, because both females are doing the choosing and males to some degree are doing the choosing, we see that some of the same processes can be explained. These aren't the only explanations, but as you go through this course, what I want you to think about is how natural selection and sexual selection might explain some of the processes that we see going on in human and animal behavior in terms of the biopsychology or neuroscience.